Hey, welcome again, gang, to this morning's Morning Coffee and a Thought, brought to you by Wings of Faith Ministries here in Sarnia, Ontario. Great to be with you. I've got my coffee here. I hope you have yours. This morning, I want to go back in the Old Testament to the writings of 2 Chronicles, chapters 17 through 21. They focus on King Jehoshaphat, the fourth king of Judah. A real stand-up guy, a man with a lot of integrity, and a man who's totally devoted to the Hebrew God Yahweh. And yet, despite the fact that he has his life together, and he's a good, able king, he's got a fatal flaw, and that is the people he hangs around with. It gets him into some trouble, and we want to talk about that, about toxic associations on this week's Morning Coffee. First of all, I want to remind you that Morning Coffee and a Thought can be seen on our YouTube channel beginning at 1 p.m. every Friday afternoon and at 8 a.m. on Sunday mornings on our Facebook page. Also, we have Journey of Insight. Al and I are discussing the foundational truths of the Christian faith that can be found in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Also, if you have a prayer request, if you want any information or you want to make a donation to our ministry, just reach out to us at wingsoffaithministries.ca. Okay, let's get back to our thought. King Jehoshaphat, who was born in 905 BCE, reigned for about 25 years, as I said, was Judah's fourth monarch. A very highly successful king. He reorganized the military of Israel and put up major garrisons around both Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, to kind of fortify his country. He had brought peace to Judah from its surrounding neighbors, and that gave him time to really organize the society. And so he brought about both social and religious reforms. As I said, he was extremely devoted to the Hebrew God Yahweh. And so religiously, he went out to reform the nation. He sent out priests and Levites to teach the masses the Torah of Moses. And he made sure that foreign deities, or high places to foreign deities, were removed from the nation. Both the Asherahs and the Ashtoreths were all removed, all their high places. And so definitely a devoted worshiper of Yahweh. He also did reforms in the social realm, especially when it came to the justice system, appointing priests to oversee cases of law, to make sure that in his mind and conscience that justice was being served to the nation. Now, as I said, he was very organized militarily, so much so that some of the surrounding countries, like the Philistines and Arabs, actually bought him tribute to maintain peace. But probably in his mind, his biggest accomplishment was he had finally achieved peace between the southern kingdoms, Judah and Benjamin, and the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that had separated from the nation after Solomon's reign. There was finally peace. Although to achieve this peace, he kind of had to, shall I say, compromise his morals. In doing this, his son, Jehoram, married Athaliah. Athaliah was the daughter of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, both of which were heavy-duty Baal worshippers. And so there was a little bit of a compromise there. But As I said, he had achieved peace, he had reorganized his country, and, as I said, a very devoted worshiper of the Hebrew God, Yahweh. But, as I said, associations were his problem. And this all starts with that marriage situation between his son Jehoram and Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab invites Jehoshaphat to come to Israel and meet him in Samaria. Jehoshaphat accepts the invitation, and when he gets there, Ahab puts on a real ceremony for Jehoshaphat. And after all the shenanigans and ceremony is over, Ahab now makes his pitch. He says to Jehoshaphat, I would like you to join me in a war to retake the town of Ramoth-Gilead back from the Arameans. Ahab believes that he was entitled to this community. Jehoshaphat agrees to go to war with him, but he wants to make sure he hears from Yahweh that Yahweh will be behind this endeavor. So Ahab summons a ton of prophets to prophesy. But all these prophets are not from the Hebrew God Yahweh. And they're all prophesying victory in this endeavor. But Jehoshaphat still has questions about it, and so he says, is there not a prophet of Yahweh here that we can ask about this? Finally, Ahab gives in and says, yes, we have a prophet. And that prophet, Micaiah, prophesies disaster for the excursion north. But despite that, and despite his warning that God is behind putting a deceiving spirit into all these prophets that have prophesied victory, Ahab and Jehoshaphat decide they're going to march against the Arameans and take back Ramoth-Gilead. Well, Micaiah's prophecy comes true. Ahab ends up being killed in this battle, and Jehoshaphat has to run for his life, barely escaping death himself. When Jehoshaphat finally gets back to Jerusalem, he runs into the prophet Jehu, who promptly scolds him in the name of Yahweh, saying, why would you associate with Ahab and collaborate with him in this endeavor? Well, Jehoshaphat kind of learned his lesson, at least temporarily. And so he sets out again in his endeavors for reforms for Judah and Benjamin. But we learn later in life that once again he hitches up with Ahab's son, Ahaziah. And together they build merchant ships that are going to sail to Spain and supposedly bring back a lot of gold. Well, it turns out that that endeavor ends badly also. The ships end up being destroyed before they can ever set sail. Jehoshaphat was a devoted follower of God, loved God with all his heart, and wanted his nation to follow in his footsteps. But Jehoshaphat's, shall we say, fatal flaw were his associations. He got involved in toxic relationships, which led him into bad behavior. And I believe he serves as a lesson for us. We can be devoted followers of Jesus Christ, but sometimes we're not very careful as to who we associate with. We can align ourselves with people who are toxic to us and can lead us into bad behaviors. Not all of a sudden, but gradually. Paul speaks about this in the writing of 2 Corinthians, where he tells the church there not to be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. In other words, don't align with people who are going to bring you down and get you involved in behaviors that you would not necessarily do if you didn't know them. Our friendships are very important because our friends can exert great influence on us, as Ahab did with Jehoshaphat. We can be talked into things or led into things that we would not normally do, all because of friendships we have established. And that's why it's so important that we keep at a distance, as Paul says, those who are not believers of Yahweh, those whose behaviors do not align with the worship of Christ, and those whose influence may lead us into doing things we would not normally do. Jehoshaphat had to learn his lesson twice, once narrowly escaping with his life, and the second time having a huge costly endeavor blow up in his face because of the fact he aligned himself with the wrong people. People have influence, and we need to be very careful who we have as close friends and confidences in our life, because we can be led very easily into doing things that could cause us grief in our lives. We can learn a lesson from Jehoshaphat. Not only do we need to be devoted to Christ, but we need to be careful who we align ourselves with. Toxic relationships can cause us grief. That's my thought for today. Enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you again next week.